February 1943. A German field marshal is writing a letter home to his wife by lamplight. Outside his tent in the Tunisian sand, 6,500 American boys are dead or captured. Their tanks are burning in a line that stretches to the horizon. He can smell the diesel smoke through the canvas walls. His hand is steady. He has good news tonight. Erwin Rommel is 51 years old. He has fought the British across this desert for 2 years. He has taken their measure. Tonight, he is taking the measure of the Americans. And what he writes to Lucy is simple. These men do not know how to fight. He is not being cruel. He is being accurate. But Rommel does not know something tonight. He does not know that in 20 months, he will be dead. Forced to swallow poison by his own Führer in a car outside his own house, while his 15-year-old son stands in the doorway watching him go. He will not live to see what the Americans become. He will not live to see a 21-year-old lieutenant from Missouri, a college boy who had never fired a shot in anger before that morning, stand on a ridge in the Belgian snow with 21 other men and refuse to move for 18 hours. He will not live to hear what his own generals say when the war is over, when they are sitting in prison camps with nothing left but the truth. If your father was there at Kasserine, or in the hedgerows of Normandy, or in the snow at Bastogne, this is the story he lived. This is why he came home changed. And this is what the men who tried to kill him said about him after it was all over. This is what they said. They said the Americans became something no European army had ever fought before. They said the transformation happened faster than any German planner had believed possible. And they said it again and again in manuscripts and memoirs and interrogation transcripts because they were trying to explain how they had lost a war they had been so certain of winning. To understand what happened, you have to start earlier. You have to start with what the Germans thought before Kasserine. In 9,939, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world by size, smaller than the Army of Bulgaria, smaller than the Army of Romania. A country of 130 million people fielded fewer soldiers than a country of 18 million. American factories produced automobiles and washing machines and refrigerators. They did not produce tanks. They did not produce artillery pieces in serious quantity. The nation had not fought a major war in 21 years. Inside the German General Staff, a phrase circulated in internal documents and private conversations. It was not meant to be flattering. It described the American armed forces as, in effect, Britain's Italians. The meaning was specific. The Americans had the raw materials of a great power, industry, population, wealth. But they lacked what the German officer corps considered the essential ingredient of military effectiveness. They lacked the hardness that comes only from long, sustained, serious combat. This assessment was not stupidity. In 1942, it was a defensible conclusion drawn from available evidence. The evidence was the First World War. American troops had arrived in France in 1917. They had fought in the Meuse-Argonne. German officers who had faced those doughboys remembered them as brave, individually, enthusiastic, sometimes reckless. They had also remembered them as tactically naive, willing to attack head-on into machine gun fire. Effective in the end, mostly because there were so many of them, and they arrived so late in a war that had already broken the German army through 4 years of attrition. The German officers who wrote the assessments of 1,942 had, many of them, fought against those doughboys personally. They were now in their 50s and 60s. They remembered. Now in 1943, the sons of those doughboys were coming ashore in North Africa. The German assumption was that the sons would resemble the fathers. The assumption was about to be tested. The test came in Tunisia, in a mountain pass called Kasserine. To understand what happened at Kasserine, you have to understand the American commander. His name was Lloyd Fredendall. He was 59 years old. He was a major general. He commanded the American Second Corps. And he was, in the honest assessment of the officers who served under him and the historians who have studied his career, one of the worst senior commanders the United States Army has produced in the modern era. Fredendall did things that later generations of officers would study as case examples of what not to do. He located his corps headquarters in an elaborate underground bunker complex carved into the side of a mountain. The bunker was 70 miles behind the front lines. Engineers who should have been preparing forward defensive positions were instead excavating his personal command post for weeks. He almost never visited the actual battlefield he was supposed to command. He made tactical decisions from a map 70 miles from the men who would carry them out. His radio communications were worse. Fredendall had developed a habit of using his own invented code language over open channels. He believed this was clever. He referred to infantry as walking boys, to tanks as elephants, specific geographic locations by nicknames he had made up personally. His subordinate commanders, receiving these transmissions in the middle of combat, sometimes had no idea what he was ordering them to do. Orders were misunderstood. Units moved to the wrong locations. Support arrived too late or arrived in the wrong place entirely. His forces were dispersed across a 30-mile front. Units were isolated. They could not support each other. Many of them contained soldiers who had arrived in North Africa only weeks earlier, some without having completed their basic training in the United States. This was the American Second Corps. On the 14th of February, 1943, Rommel struck through the passes of central Tunisia with the confidence of a professional who had already read the intelligence reports and drawn his conclusions. His 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions moved through gaps in the American line that should not have existed. They found American artillery positions unprepared to receive an armored assault. They found American infantry in the open, without proper defensive works. Panzer IVs of the Wehrmacht rolled forward. Note that word, Panzer IV. Not the Panthers that did not yet exist. Not the Tigers that were still rare and mostly absent from this fight. The German tanks that broke the American line at Kasserine were medium tanks, in the same weight class as the American Sherman. The Germans did not win because they had a technological miracle. They won because they knew how to use the equipment they had. American units began breaking. Officers lost contact with their men. Some officers lost contact with reality. Communications collapsed. Units that were supposed to support each other never made contact. Isolated American positions were destroyed in detail by concentrated German assaults. The retreat began. It should have been an orderly withdrawal to prepared positions in the rear. Instead, it became a rout. Men on foot, men in trucks, officers driving jeeps in the wrong direction past their own soldiers without stopping to give orders. Panic spread faster than the German advance. 6,500 American casualties, 3,000 of them captured, a rout of 85 miles. And on the receiving end of the disaster, Rommel, writing to Lucy by lamplight. General Omar Bradley, who would later command more than 1 million American soldiers in the invasion of France, wrote in his memoirs that Kasserine was probably the worst performance of United States Army troops in their whole proud history. He was not wrong. But here is the first turn in this story. The reason Kasserine was a catastrophe was not that the American soldier was fundamentally weak. It was not that American training was fundamentally broken. It was not that the American character lacked something the German character possessed. The reason Kasserine was a catastrophe was that the American command structure had produced Lloyd Fredendall, and Lloyd Fredendall was in charge. The Germans looked at Kasserine and saw evidence of American weakness. What they were actually looking at was evidence of one man's incompetence, magnified by circumstances into a disaster of national scale. Distinction would matter, because the Americans, unlike the Germans, were about to do something with it. Within days of the disaster ending, General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in North Africa, made a decision. He fired Lloyd Fredendall, not disciplined him, not reassigned him with a stern conversation, fired him. On the 4th of March, 1943, less than 2 weeks after the Kasserine catastrophe ended, Fredendall was relieved of command. 2 days later, Patton took over. Fredendall was sent home to the United States, where he was quietly reassigned to a training command far from any active theater. Consider what that meant. A senior German general who failed catastrophically in the field was often protected. He might be reassigned. He might be quietly moved to a staff position. He might, in some cases, be promoted to get him out of an operational command. He was almost never fired outright, publicly and quickly. The professional officer corps protected its own. In the American way of doing business in 1943, an incompetent major general could be identified, relieved, and replaced inside of 3 weeks. This was not a small difference. This was, though the Germans did not yet see it, a decisive difference. Rommel in the sand was not just writing to his wife about a defeated enemy. He was writing about an enemy that had, by the time his letter reached Germany, already begun to reorganize itself under new leadership. In Fredendall's place, Eisenhower sent George Patton. Patton was 57 years old. He was a lieutenant general. He was profane, theatrical, obsessed with military history, obsessed with discipline. By many accounts, a difficult man to serve under. He was also exactly what the shattered Second Corps needed. Patton descended on his new command like a storm. He demanded that soldiers wear neckties in the desert. He fined officers who appeared out of proper uniform. He personally screamed at men in the field for lapses in discipline that would have been overlooked under Fredendall. He threatened court-martial for cowardice. He was often unfair. He was sometimes cruel. Nothing about Patton was gentle. But something about Patton worked. Within weeks, the Second Corps was a different organization. Not because Patton had given it new equipment. Not because he had brought in new soldiers. The equipment was the same. The soldiers were the same. What had changed was the atmosphere, the expectations, the tolerance for incompetence at every level of the chain of command. Something began to bother Rommel in the weeks that followed. Something that did not fit his initial assessment. The Americans, after Kasserine, were not behaving the way defeated armies were supposed to behave. They were not demoralized. They were not passive. They were not waiting for someone else to solve their problems. They were reorganizing. They were reorganizing fast. He recorded it in his private papers, in a passage his family would preserve, and Basil Liddell Hart would publish after the war. The Americans in Tunisia had paid a stiff price for their experience, he observed, but the price had brought rich dividends. Even in the closing weeks of the North African campaign, American generals were showing themselves advanced in the tactical handling of their forces. He was watching an army learn. He was one of the first German officers to see it clearly. Others would follow. Some of them would not see it until the summer of 1944, when it was too late. Some of them would not see it until it was already over. The men who had run at Kasserine were about to be given another chance. Same divisions, same regiments, same men, still shaken by their first taste of the Wehrmacht, still wondering whether they had what it took to face a professional army. They were about to find out. 4 weeks after the disaster ended, at a place called El Getar, they would meet the 10th Panzer Division again. The Germans expected another Kasserine. They would not get one. The morning of the 23rd of March, 1943, the sun rises over a valley in southern Tunisia called El Getar. The men waiting in the ground that morning are the same men who ran at Kasserine. Same divisions, same regiments, in many cases, same platoons. The 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, dug in across the valley approaches. Their commander is Major General Terry Allen. He is 54 years old. He is a hard drinker. He is a hard fighter. He has a reputation in the peacetime army as a man who cannot be promoted because he will not stop cursing in front of senior officers. Allen has told his men in the days before this morning that he will personally shoot any soldier who retreats without orders. His men believe him. Across the valley, the 10th Panzer Division is preparing to attack. These are the same men who broke the American line at Kasserine 5 weeks ago. They are professional soldiers, experienced, confident, by the standards of 1,943 among the best armored troops in the world. They expect this morning to end the way February ended. They expect Americans to run. The German tanks begin moving at first light, 50 of them, moving through the morning haze, moving toward positions they believe are held by men who have already been broken once. They roll into a minefield the Americans have laid in the night. The lead tanks stop. Some of them stop because they are burning. The column behind them is now channelized, forced into narrow lanes between the mines, unable to maneuver, unable to spread out and use the desert terrain the way German armor was designed to fight. American tank destroyers open fire from hidden positions on the flanks. German tanks begin to burn, and then something else begins to happen. The artillery begins. For the German tank crews in the valley that morning, and for the German infantry advancing behind them, the artillery is unlike anything they have experienced in this war. It does not come from a single direction. It does not build up gradually. It does not give them time to disperse, to seek cover, to react. It arrives everywhere at once. The bombardment walks across their formation with a precision they cannot explain. When they try to withdraw, it follows them. When they try to concentrate for another push, it concentrates on them faster. Observers they cannot see are directing the fire. Aircraft they cannot reach are circling overhead. The shells fall in patterns that suggest coordination between batteries the Germans have never seen before. By the end of the day, more than 30 German tanks are burning or disabled on the approach to the pass. The rest have withdrawn. German infantry, caught in the open by the artillery, are dead in windrows across the valley floor. Prisoners begin to filter back to American lines through the afternoon and evening. Some of the prisoners are weeping when they are interrogated. They tell their American captors, through translators, that this is the first time in the entire war they have been stopped by artillery and infantry alone, without significant American armor pressing them. They tell them the artillery was of a kind they had not encountered before. Not just heavier, not just more of it. Different. The German officers on the ridge behind the failed attack cannot yet explain what they have seen. What they have encountered on the morning of the 23rd of March, 1943, in a small valley in Tunisia, is something the American army has been building quietly for 20 years. In a place none of these men have ever heard of. To understand what happened at El Getar, you have to travel to the flat plains of southwestern Oklahoma, to a dusty army post called Fort Sill. Fort Sill in the 1920s and 1930s was not a glamorous assignment. The United States Army after the First World War had shrunk to a size smaller than the Army of Bulgaria. Budgets were minimal. Careers stalled. Officers who had commanded regiments in France in 1918 were now teaching theory classes to small groups of lieutenants in Oklahoma, waiting for retirement. Among those officers were men who had watched the artillery war of 1914 through 1918, who had seen what massed guns could do when properly coordinated, who had also seen, in the American experience of that war, how badly American artillery had been coordinated compared to the French and the Germans. They spent the interwar years thinking about the problem. Their most important thinker was a man named Leslie McNair. In 1943, he is a lieutenant general. He is 59 years old. He is nearly deaf from an artillery accident in France in 1918. He wears a hearing aid. He speaks softly. He is not famous in 1943, and he will not become famous. But he is one of the most consequential American officers of the entire war. McNair and the officers around him at Fort Sill developed something in the 1930s that no other army in the world would possess in the 1940s. They called it the Fire Direction Center. The idea was simple to describe and revolutionary in practice. In the German army and in the British army, an artillery battery was largely its own commander. It had its own forward observer. It received its own targeting information. It fired its own missions. Coordination between multiple batteries required time-consuming staff work at higher headquarters. In the American system built at Fort Sill, coordination was centralized at the battalion level. Any forward observer anywhere on the battlefield could call for fire. The request went to a central fire direction center. That center could then compute firing solutions for every battery in range within minutes. It could mask the fire of multiple batteries on a single target. It could shift that fire from target to target as the battlefield changed. Concentrate the guns of an entire division, or in some circumstances, an entire corps, on a single point of enemy strength. The mathematics of ballistic calculation were simplified through mechanical firing tables and standardized procedures. What took a German artillery unit 10 to 12 minutes from fire request to shells on target, the American network could do in 7 minutes. That was the difference. 7 minutes between an American forward observer spotting a target and the same observer at a German position spotting the equivalent target. 7 minutes on a battlefield is the difference between a tank column that gets away and a tank column that burns in the open. This was the machinery that the 10th Panzer Division met at El Guetar. They had no name for it. They had no way to describe it to their officers except as concentrated fire of unusual accuracy. The word they were reaching for, but had not yet learned, was integration. The Americans had built something whole, and now, in the sky above the German positions, they added another element. A small, unarmed aircraft with fabric-covered wings, a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, could not fight. It carried no weapons. It flew barely faster than an automobile on a country road, but it could see. And what it saw, the Fire Direction Center could kill. German soldiers in the summer of 1943, and every summer that followed, would learn to dread the sound of that little aircraft circling overhead. When the Grasshopper appeared over a German position, the men on the ground knew what came next. Within minutes, shells falling with precision that seemed almost supernatural. There was no answer to it. The Luftwaffe was not present in sufficient numbers to hunt the grasshoppers. Anti-aircraft fire could be attempted, but the aircraft flew too low and too slow and too maneuverably for reliable engagement. The only reliable defense was to hide, to not move during daylight, to dig deeper, and pray that the observer would not notice you. For the rest of the war, that was the German infantry experience of American artillery. Now, move forward in time, to December of 1944, to another element of the American system that arrives in the field for the first time. Its official designation is the variable time fuse. In Army slang, it will become known as the funny fuse. The total program cost exceeded $1 billion, one of the largest weapons investments of the war after the atomic bomb. It is a miniature radar set, small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. What it does is simple to describe. The shell descends toward its target. The fuse detects the ground approaching. It triggers detonation at the optimal height above the surface, approximately 30 feet, where the fragmentation pattern will be most lethal. Consequences are catastrophic for infantry. Before the funny fuse, an artillery shell landing near a foxhole would often bury itself in the earth before exploding, wasting much of its lethal energy underground. A soldier in a deep foxhole with proper overhead cover had a reasonable chance of surviving the blast. After the funny fuse, shells burst in the air above the foxhole. Fragments came down at the men inside from above, at high velocity, striking them in the head and shoulders, where they had no protection. General George Patton wrote to the War Department after the first field use of the weapon. His words are preserved. He said the new shell was devastating. He said his men had caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River. By actual body count, 702 of them in a single artillery concentration. 702 men, one battalion, one artillery mission. This was what the Germans would meet in the second half of 1944. But before we get to Normandy, one truth must be said, and it must be said plainly, because it is often forgotten. The Americans were not fighting alone in the West. British were there, the Canadians were there, the Poles were there, the French were there. The story that says the Germans feared the Americans, but not the British, is, in its simplest form, wrong. The Germans respected the British. They feared certain British formations. They had learned to respect them the hard way, over 3 years of hard fighting in the desert against Montgomery. German fear of the American army had a different texture from the German respect for the British army. And understanding that texture requires understanding what the British were actually doing in 1944. Consider what Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt did in Normandy. Rundstedt was 68 years old in 1944. He was the senior field marshal in the German army in the West. He was Prussian aristocracy, career officer, a man whose family had produced soldiers for the Kingdom of Prussia and then the German Empire for 2 centuries. Rundstedt looked at the Normandy front after the Allied landings and made a decision. He would concentrate the bulk of his available armored forces against the British and Canadian sector around the city of Caen. 6 out of 7 panzer divisions committed to Normandy would face the British and Canadians. Only 1 would face the Americans in the West. There is a myth that this happened because the terrain around Caen favored armored defense. The terrain was part of it. But the deeper reason was different. The Germans believed the British would attack in ways they could predict and prepare for. British operations followed patterns their intelligence officers could anticipate. Days of visible logistical buildup, hours of preliminary bombardment, then set-piece attacks along predictable axes. They thought they could hold against that. They thought they could not hold against what the Americans were preparing. So they committed their best forces against the British, and they left a lighter screen against the Americans, and they waited to see what would happen. What this meant for the British and Canadian soldiers around Caen is that they faced the most concentrated armored forces the Wehrmacht deployed anywhere on the Western Front. They faced the 1st SS Panzer Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division, Panzerlehr, 2nd SS Panzer, the 21st Panzer. Weeks of grinding, attritional combat against the finest armored units the enemy possessed. The Canadian 3rd Division, landing at Juno Beach on the 6th of June, sustained casualties rates in the first 24 hours comparable to the American losses at Omaha. The British Second Army lost roughly 16,000 men killed in Normandy, 58,000 casualties overall for the British sector by the end of the campaign. These were not soft numbers. These were not the casualties of an army that was, as some later writers would sneer, holding back and letting the Americans do the fighting. The British approach to the war was shaped by something the Americans had never experienced. The First World War. The Somme, Passchendaele, nearly 1 million British Empire dead in a 4-year war that had traumatized a nation. Britain in 1944 had a manpower crisis that the United States, with its vastly larger population, did not face. Every British division committed to Normandy was, in a real sense, the last British division available. They lost this generation of soldiers. There was no replacement. British commanders knew this. They fought accordingly. Their caution was not cowardice. It was arithmetic. It was memory. The Germans respected them for it. The Germans also killed a great many of them. The Americans, meanwhile, faced a different problem. Not weaker opposition in the aggregate, but a different kind of terrain. And in that terrain, in the summer of 1944, they discovered something else about themselves that would shock the Germans when they finally understood it. The Normandy countryside inland from the American beaches was called the bocage, hedgerow country, not the neat hedges of English gardens. These were ancient earthen banks, some of them over 1,000 years old, built up over centuries of farmers piling stones and roots and dirt at the edges of their fields. The banks were often 10 feet high, sometimes 15, topped with dense vegetation grown into an impenetrable wall. Every field in the bocage was a natural fortress. German machine gunners set up in the corners of each field, with interlocking fields of fire across the open ground. American infantry crossing the field died in the open. American tanks trying to push through the hedgerow had to climb up and over, exposing their thin belly armor to concealed anti-tank guns on the other side. For 6 weeks after the landings, the American advance in the bocage measured in yards. Casualties measured in the thousands per week. Some divisions were nearly destroyed as coherent units. The 29th Infantry Division, which had landed at Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, would take casualties across the summer, approaching 100% of its original strength. Not the same men every time. Replacements filled the ranks as the veterans fell. American commanders were desperate. The doctrine they had trained on did not work in this terrain. Every attack met the same result: men dying in the open fields, tanks burning on top of the hedgerows. And then, somewhere in the American sector in the second half of June, a sergeant did something remarkable. His name was Curtis Grubb Coolin III. He was 29 years old. He was from Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he had worked a clerical job in New York City. He had enlisted in 1940. He was now a sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Coolin had been thinking about the hedgerow problem. He had been thinking about the steel obstacles that the Germans had installed on the invasion beaches. Thousands of pieces of scrap steel now scattered across the Norman coast, rusting in the sea air. He proposed cutting up that steel, welding it into forward-facing prongs, mounting the prongs to the front of a Sherman tank. Then driving the tank straight into the base of a hedgerow, the prongs would tear through the earthen bank. The tank would push through at ground level, not climbing, not exposing its belly. Infantry could advance through the breach behind it. The hedgerow, which had been an unbreakable fortress for 6 weeks, would become a passage. Coolin built a prototype. He showed it to his officers. His officers showed it to General Omar Bradley. Bradley, 51 years old, First Army commander, watched the demonstration. Then he ordered the device into mass production immediately. By the 3rd week of July, 3 out of every 5 Sherman tanks in the American First Army were equipped with Coolin's hedgerow cutters. The device was kept secret from German intelligence to maximize its surprise value. Ordnance units worked around the clock, cutting up German beach obstacles, welding them into the American solution. The reason this matters is not that Sergeant Coolin was a genius. He was a competent, thoughtful young man who saw a problem and proposed a solution. The reason it matters is what it says about how the American Army functioned. A sergeant's idea in this army could reach a lieutenant general in days. That lieutenant general could approve it in minutes. Mass production could begin within a week. Deployment across the front could happen within 3 weeks. The rigid hierarchies that made European staff work so precise also made European innovation slow. The American structure had chosen speed over ceremony. And now, in the summer of 1944, the choice was paying dividends the Wehrmacht could not match. By the 25th of July, 1944, the Americans were ready for what came next. They called it Operation Cobra. It would begin with 1,500 heavy bombers dropping their loads on a rectangle of French countryside, roughly 4 miles long and 1.5 miles deep. In that rectangle, holding what he believed was one of the strongest sections of the German line in Normandy, was a German general named Fritz Bayerlein. He was 45 years old. He commanded the Panzer Lehr Division. He had been Rommel's chief of staff in the desert. He knew the Americans, or he thought he did. He had watched them at Kasserine. 7 o'clock on the morning of the 25th of July, the first bombs began to fall. The bombardment lasted for more than 2 hours. When it ended, the terrain that Panzer Lehr had held was gone. Not damaged, gone, rolled over, the earth itself pulverized to a depth of several feet across the entire target rectangle. Bayerlein emerged from his command post in the days that followed. His division no longer existed. But there was one more casualty that morning that Bayerlein would never know about. Standing in a forward observation post on the American side of the line, watching the bombs fall on Panzer Lehr, was a small, deaf, 61-year-old lieutenant general. He was Leslie McNair, the man who had built the artillery system that made this moment possible. 20 years of work at Fort Sill, finally paying its debt in French soil. He was standing in the wrong field. Some of the American bombers that morning dropped their loads short. Leslie McNair was killed by his own army. The architect died watching his cathedral open. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater of the entire war. His body was so mangled by the bombing that he was identified only by the 3 stars on his collar. The men who buried him did not tell his family how he died. Not for a long time. Bayerlein would spend the rest of his life trying to explain, in manuscripts written for American historians, what had happened to him on that morning. He would write 20 of them. He would never find the right words. The 16th of December, 1944, 4:30 in the morning. The Ardennes forest is buried in fog and snow. Along an 80-mile stretch of the American line, 200,000 German soldiers are moving into their attack positions. This is the last strategic reserve of the Third Reich. Every remaining tank, every remaining panzer division, every liter of gasoline the Wehrmacht has been able to hoard for 6 months. Adolf Hitler has committed it all to a single desperate offensive. His plan rests on a single assumption. The assumption is that the American soldier is still what he was at Kasserine. Soft, poorly led, prone to panic under sudden pressure from experienced German troops. Hitler tells his generals in the briefings leading up to the attack that the American front will collapse within days. In one sector on the first morning, the assumption appears to be correct. The 106th Infantry Division is holding a quiet section of the line near the Schnee Eifel. They arrived in Europe only a few weeks earlier. They have never seen combat. When the German assault falls on them, 2 of their 3 regiments are surrounded within 48 hours. On the 19th of December, approximately 7,000 American soldiers surrender. It is the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater. The pattern of Kasserine appears to be repeating itself. Hitler, in his bunker, reads the reports and permits himself hope he should not have, because Hitler has misunderstood what happened at Kasserine, and he has misunderstood what has changed since. The Americans of December 1944 are not the Americans of February 1943. They have a different system now. They have different men. And that system is already, within hours of the initial breakthrough, doing what the Wehrmacht cannot do. It is moving. On the 17th of December, one day into the offensive, an SS armored column under a 29-year-old lieutenant colonel named Joachim Pieper reaches a crossroads called Baugnes, near the Belgian town of Malmedy. Pieper's column captures roughly 113 American soldiers from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The Americans are disarmed. They are marched into a field beside the road, and then, on the orders of officers whose exact identities are still debated by historians, they are shot down with machine guns. Approximately 84 American prisoners die in the field at Malmedy that afternoon. A small number escape into the trees, wounded, and reach American lines to report what has happened. The story spreads through the American army within hours. And here is where the American record must be told honestly, because it will not be told honestly by those who prefer their history simple. In the days after Malmedy, informal orders circulated in some American units. Do not take SS prisoners. On the 1st of January, 1945, at a Belgian town called Chinon, American soldiers of Company B, 21st Armored Infantry Battalion, executed somewhere between 21 and 60 German prisoners of war. The exact number is still disputed. Incident was investigated by American Army authorities. No one was ever prosecuted. The record remains in the archives for any historian willing to read it. This is what war does, not on one side, on both sides. And the story of American infantry in the Ardennes is not the story of angels defeating demons. It is the story of soldiers doing what soldiers do in a war that had already taught them what the enemy was capable of, and what they themselves were capable of in response. Now hold that truth and return to the ridges. On the same day Paper is executing prisoners at Malmedy, 22 American soldiers are holding a position on a small ridge outside a Belgian village called Lanzerath. Their commander is First Lieutenant Lyle Bach Jr. He turns 21 years old on the day of the battle. He was a college student in St. Louis, Missouri before the war. He now leads the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division. He has 18 men. 4 forward artillery observers from another unit have joined him on the ridge. 22 men, advancing toward them along the road that runs through Lanzerath toward the American rear is the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, elite German paratroopers of the Luftwaffe, approximately 500 men. They are the vanguard of Pieper's larger battle group. They must clear the road for the armored column that follows. Buch and his men are supposed to observe and report. They are not supposed to fight. They fight anyway. For 18 hours, 22 Americans on a small ridge stop 500 German paratroopers cold. The Germans attack again and again across the open ground. The Americans, in prepared positions with automatic weapons, cut them down, wave after wave, until the Americans run out of ammunition, until they are surrounded, until they are captured one by one at close quarters in the freezing dusk. Buck himself is captured on his 21st birthday with a shattered leg and his teeth broken by a German soldier who punches him in the face during interrogation. He spends the rest of the war in a prison camp. He is not welcomed home as a hero in 1945. His platoon's action goes almost as entirely unrecognized for 37 years. It is not until October of 1981 that the survivors are finally awarded proper recognition. By that time, several of them are dead. Buch himself is a middle-aged dentist in Missouri when the medal finally arrives. But on the 17th of December, 1944, on that ridge, 22 young men delayed the German timetable by 18 critical hours. The armored column behind them arrived at its next objective a full day late. And in this offensive, in this terrain, in this weather, a day was everything. To the north, on higher ground called Elsenborn Ridge, 3 American infantry divisions were building the defensive line that would decide the entire battle. The 2nd Division, the 99th Division, the 1st Division, the big red one, the same division that had held at El Guitar 21 months earlier. They dug in on the ridge. They wired their positions. They registered their artillery. Then the 6th Panzer Army came at them, the SS Army under Sepp Dietrich, the main effort of the entire German offensive, the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, composed of fanatical young men indoctrinated since childhood in Nazi ideology. Attack after attack across the open ground below Elsenborn Ridge. And into every attack, the American artillery came down. 348 guns eventually massed on this sector. Battalion after battalion, using the same technique McNair had built in Oklahoma before most of these gunners were born. Time on target concentrations. The funny fuse bursting overhead. coordinated across the entire American front by an artillery command that could shift its weight from one point to another in minutes. The 12th SS attacked repeatedly, and repeatedly they died in the fields below Elsenborn. By the end of the fighting on the ridge, the 12th SS had ceased to exist as an effective combat formation. Its tanks burned where the artillery had caught them. Its young infantrymen lay dead in windrows across the snow. The northern shoulder of the German offensive was broken. It had not moved. And 40 miles to the south, at a Belgian town called Bastogne, another American position was being surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division had raced to Bastogne from a rest area in France. They arrived exhausted, under strength, some of them without proper winter clothing. With them was Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, remnants of other units that had retreated into the perimeter. The German forces surrounding them outnumbered them substantially. On the 22nd of December, a German officer approached the American lines under a white flag, carried an ultimatum: surrender the town or face annihilation by concentrated artillery. The ultimatum was brought to the acting division commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. He was 46 years old. He was an artilleryman by training. He was tired. He had probably not slept in days. He read the German ultimatum. He said one word: nuts. The word was not a prepared statement. It was not a slogan. It was simply what came out of his mouth when he read the demand. His staff officers had to figure out what to write in the formal reply. Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment eventually delivered the response to the German emissaries. According to Harper's post-war account, when the Germans asked what nuts meant, he told them it meant, in effect, go to hell. The word itself, nuts, entered American memory that day. It was the answer of an army that had learned, in 22 months of hard war, what it was capable of. 4 days later, on the 26th of December, the lead elements of General Patton's Third Army broke through the German ring around Bastogne. Patton had pivoted his entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter and advanced up to 100 miles in a week to reach the town. It was, by any measure, one of the greatest feats of operational movement in the history of warfare. The Battle of the Bulge continued into January. It ground on. Men froze to death in foxholes. Tanks were destroyed. The German offensive, which had promised to reach Antwerp and split the Allied armies, achieved none of its strategic objectives. By the end of January, the last reserves of the Third Reich were gone, and the German generals who survived the war were left with a question they would spend the rest of their lives trying to answer. They would try to answer it in prisoner of war interrogations, in manuscripts written for the Foreign Military Studies program, in memoirs published in the 1950s and 60s, in interviews given to historians who traveled to Germany to find them in the years before they died. Field Marshal von Rundstedt told his interrogators that the war in the West had been lost in Normandy. Alfred Jodl said the same. Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg concept, acknowledged that George Patton had conducted his campaign as Guderian himself would have conducted it. High professional praise from the highest possible source. But it was a German general named Friedrich von Mellenthin who came closest to the truth. He wrote his memoir Panzer Battles in 1956. He had fought Americans, British, and Soviets. He had thought carefully about all three. He wrote that the German army had underestimated not the American soldier, but the society that produced him. A society that could take farmers and clerks and mechanics from every corner of a vast continent and turn them into effective soldiers in 18 months. A society that could equip them better than any army had ever been equipped. A society that could learn from its failures and adapt faster than any European planner had believed possible. The Germans had not feared the American soldier. They had learned to fear America itself. And here, in the final honesty of this story, one more truth must be added. The German army lost the Second World War primarily in the East. Between 75 and 80% of Wehrmacht casualties were inflicted by the Soviet Union. The Americans and the British and the Canadians fought a hard war on the Western Front, and they fought it well. But the mass of German blood was spilled by the Red Army. The men who ran at Kasserine were, in most cases, not the same men who held at Elsenborn Ridge. Many of them were dead by December of 1944. The 29th Division had turned over close to 100% of its combat strength between Omaha Beach and the Rhine. The American army that emerged from the war was, in a real sense, a new army, built on the bones of the one that had landed in North Africa. Erwin Rommel did not live to see any of it. He was forced to take poison by Hitler's order on the 14th of October, 1944, 2 months before the Battle of the Bulge began. He was 52 years old. He died believing many things about the Americans that he would not have believed by the end of December. The historian's task is not to say which side was better. It is to say which side learned faster. For 22 months, from the sand of Tunisia to the snow of Belgium, the American army learned faster, paid a price for that learning. Thousands of men are still buried in the cemeteries of Normandy and the Ardennes. Their sons and grandsons are watching this now, and they know the price. But the record shows what the record shows. And the German generals who wrote it down, in their own words, in the years after they lost, gave us the answer to the question this story began with. The common thread in their memoirs was this: they had never been afraid of the American soldier as an individual. They had been afraid of what he became when the system behind him began to work. They wrote again and again that they had never fought anyone like him before, and that they hoped they would never have to fight him again.